Welcome to Uncommon Courage, the podcast. I don't do a lot of these days. I'm focused on the live streams. But there's some really cool people I know that operate outside of the time zone that makes it a respectable time for them to join the shows. So I might do a few more. And today we are going to talk about ecotheology. Now, if you don't know me, I was brought up in a Catholic family and I rejected it outright. So I am not part of any organized religion, but I have respect for all faiths. And ecotheology wasn't really a subject that I'd come across before. And I met this chap called Lature, and I actually have to ask him if I'm saying his surname right. And he's part of a community called the Climate Crisis Club that I'm part of. And every time he speaks, he really he makes me think. And I thought it'd be really great to expose everybody else to this lovely gentleman, and hopefully we can all get a better understanding of ecotheology. So I'm going to introduce you now. Here is Dale. Did I say your surname correctly? Lature?
Yeah.
Oh, good. I forgot to ask you. Anyway, we are seeing each other for the first time. It's usually late on a Saturday night, and all I ever hear is your voice. So I see your face, and you've got a much bigger beard than you have in your profile photo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen you on some of your shows, but
yeah, right. Well, you're cheating.
Yeah.
So just to kick it off, you've got a fantastic story, and you've done lots and lots of different things. Just to give people a sense, especially of the religious journey that you've been on as well, so people know that you're coming at this from a very, very deep place. So do you want to kick it off? I'm gonna highlight you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I grew up in, one of the more conservative strands of American Christianity. It wasn't as conservative then as it became later, but that's the Southern Baptist tradition. It's now well known as a very right wing place, and that kind of took off when I was in seminary. So it was an interesting time to be in seminary because the denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, was changing dramatically. That was in the 80s. But just prior to that, like when my family moved all around, we lived in Alabama, West Virginia, and then Kentucky. And we were in Kentucky my high school years and all throughout my college years. And I went to college in Western Kentucky at Murray State, where my dad went, and that's where I was born when my dad was graduating from college in 1956. Wow. And so I went back there, as did my two brothers. And in Owensboro, Kentucky, which is a town in Western Kentucky on the Ohio River, we moved there in 1970 when I was starting high school, or like the summer, at the beginning of the summer before I started high school. And so my parents, looking about for, what church to join, the youth group at First Baptist Church in Owensboro, Kentucky had been on a mission trip. And so they were just fresh off of that, and they were like leading. The Southern Baptists do Sunday night as well as Sunday morning. So on Sunday nights, they tend to do more laid back kind of stuff. And so they had the youth lead the service, and they had a few testimonies in the Sunday morning because it was just bubbling over so much, and they had to include something about that. But so my parents saw that and heard the testimonies and met the youth minister, and they said, "This is the place that we ought to come." And that was sort of the priority over how well my dad liked the preacher, which he liked. He liked him fine too. Yeah, I remember him saying several times, "He's the best I've ever heard." But that youth minister exposed all of us to so many diverse theological expressions, and I credit that forever, for the journey that I undertook. And one of the major ones And so you asked me about books and resources, and so I'm always ready to grab stuff off my shelf. In fact, in the back there, you can see up to the left of me, there's books leaning over because I've got all these books off that bookshelf. And there's like several shelves above that have books leaning over because I've got like probably about 20 books sitting out here around me. But this book is called Call to Commitment. And it's, ragged because it was in my grandfather's library, who was a Baptist preacher, my mom's dad. That was in Cadiz, Kentucky. And for some reason, I mean, I was 10 years old when he died. And then, I remember them loading up books into the back of the car, and the car, like, almost hitting the ground in the back because there were so many books in the trunk. And they were taking them off to give them away to, used bookstores, or I don't know what they gave them to. But a few of the books ended up at our house. And I guess my dad was interested in this because of Call of Commitment, and it was about a church. And I don't think he ever read it, but I remember seeing it on our bookshelf, and just, didn't even think about it much later until some people in my youth group, because my youth minister had told us about this church, and it's Church of the Savior in Washington, D.C., that they started reading this. And so I said, I had that book. It's been sitting on our bookshelf for years. And so I picked it up and started reading along with them, and just got, totally blown away by the concept of what church is about, or what it should be about. The founding.
How old were you?
What's that?
How old were you then?
20.
Right. So
it's 1976.
So you were never a naughty boy. You're always a good boy.
Right. Never have a drink of alcohol until 1984.
Oh, wow. Really? Okay.
I think I had one by mistake where, somebody had a Coke can on some bleachers at a basketball game. And then I had a Coke can next to me. And then I reached over to the other side of me out of habit and took a swig, and it was a can of beer.
Oh,
instead of a Coke that I was drinking. And I was repulsed because I was expecting Coke and got beer. And
yeah.
So anyway, so this founding minister, Gordon Cosby, had been a, evangelical preacher in Virginia. And then he went to war, World War II, was a chaplain. And that experience kind of changed him, talking to people who were about to go out and didn't know whether they'd ever, come back again. On the front and things like that. And so he started thinking about, how, what the message of the church is supposed to be. And it wasn't about, afterlife, but it was about community, and about, what is life about, not so much the afterlife, but what, this life is and how important it is. And so he came back and set up shop in Washington, D.C., and they started his church in 1948. And so this person that wrote these books was a PR specialist and a writer, and so she kind of did the history of this church. And so I've got all those books about that. One of them's the new community, and then this one's where the eco stuff starts getting planted in my brain or in my heart, or what have you. But journey inward, journey outward. And so they were very much into the spiritual life and being accountable to one another, but also having a mission and having an outward mission and having some impact somewhere. And so out of that church, they have so many different divergent ministries, and one of them is called Dayspring, which is an ecological community that's that they have a few people that live there out. It used to be out in the country, but now it's part of the suburb of Washington, D.C. area. And I drove out there. What's that?
So could I just clarify? So the Southern Baptist Church, so it's not all the same. Are they all? They are all a little bit different depending on
Right.
who leads them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it used to be, mentioned as one of the mainline denominations. It's not, it's not anymore because they've
Yeah.
become so independent and fundamentalist leaning. When I was in seminary there was this big battle about, um, what that seminary was teaching versus what the powers that be that were coming up and taking over things in the Southern Baptist life thought should be getting taught. And so they started laying down the law about what you could and couldn't teach.
Okay.
And
And then is it a unified church now, or is it sort of splintered and there's lots of different sort of
well,
representations?
most of the professors that I had when I was there, who weren't, of that ilk, uh, pretty much joined a denomination, or I don't know if it's considered a denomination. It's still kind of considered a splinter, but the Cooperative Baptist and they have their own seminary and their own bookstores and their own curriculum now, because they just couldn't take it anymore. Their sense of mission was getting interrupted because there were too many. I don't know what you call it, objections, from the far right, and it was just interfering with doing good work because they weren't saying the right things or saying things in the right way, and I was in seminary during that time, and the people that I hung around with, and we sat around in the dormitory talking, and Reagan was about to get elected and did get elected during my time in seminary there. So there were lots of discussions about that, both, out of class, and some classes like kind of took the whole hour and talked about what was coming up with Reagan.
Yeah.
So
it's so interesting. I mean, churches are always dealing with their own internal sort of forces, right? So seminary. So tell me a little bit about that. So did you then go on to become a preacher, or
I was there heading into youth ministry, because I had a dynamic youth ministry experience, and so that's what I wanted to do. And so I was there, and most of the people that went into youth ministry took an education track, Master of Religious Education. I did the MDiv because I wanted more of the theology.
Right.
And so that's what I did. And
so MDiv, just for people, is Masters of Divinity, right?
Yeah. And and so I did a couple of summer stints, which a lot of going into ministry people did in seminary. They would and they would even work weekends at these churches while they were in seminary, and so seminary didn't have class on Monday because all of these students were out in the field on the weekend, working at church either part-time or full-time that for the weekend, and then come back and then have classes Tuesday, Friday, and then Friday they'd take off, and that's what I did. I went to Cincinnati, starting in the fall of '79, and was at that church, for those next two summers, 1980 and '81, and during the school year I was there on the weekends. And then my first full-time job was in Iowa, in southeast Iowa, at a American Baptist church, which is that was the part of the Baptists that split during the Civil War. So the Southern Baptists were the slave churches, and the American Baptists were the northern churches. And so my first job was a American Baptist, but it might have as well been a Southern Baptist church. It was very conservative. And then I became a Lutheran, because I went. My next position was at a Lutheran church in Phoenix, Arizona, and then that was the end of my youth ministry days, because I had gotten married just before that in 1983, and so was spending a lot more time with my wife rather than hanging out with the kids, which I did as a single person. a lot more. They were sort of my group, and then that wasn't true anymore. And so and then I had started to become interested in media and technology communications.
Yeah.
And so my aim was to get into that in the church related communications area.
Yeah.
And
you had various levels of success there, right?
yeah. After that Phoenix, Arizona youth ministry experience, we moved back to Cincinnati. I started selling electronics. And then eventually, after almost 10 years, well, it wasn't 10 years of that, but we moved back to Cincinnati in 85. We were about to have our first child, who's now 30 something. And I was in a bookstore, a Baptist bookstore, looking at books. And no, it was a Cokesbury bookstore, actually. That's the United Methodist bookstore line.
Yeah, we could have a whole discussion just about American religions, right?
Yeah,
there's so many.
I saw a book by a guy who had written a bunch of youth ministry resources that I had used, and I'd actually talked to this guy a couple of times, to ask him, what else he saw in these areas, because he had written and done a lot of youth resources on using the media for ministry and discussing music and things like that. And so I picked up his book and looked at the back to see what he's up to now. And he was in Dayton, Ohio, which is just up, 40 miles up the road, and starting this religious communications program at the seminary. They were the first seminary to have a communications degree. And it was, mainly centered around media type things, sort of a media awareness communications. And so I ended up entering that program in late '89, just after my son was born. In fact, we took him when we visited to check out a couple of classes. We took him with us. He was in his little rocker, and he was sitting there on my desk, sitting in class. But and so that was 1990 and 91. So that was 10 years after my MDiv. I got my what we call the MARC degree, which is the Master's of Arts in Religious Communication. And what also was happening during that time was the internet was starting up, and computers were starting to get sold, personal computers. And so I as a technology nerd at the time, or still am, that became integrated into all of this, and I got put in charge of getting things organized in the audio and video studio at the seminary. And so they had all this technology, and I got involved in it and got things hooked up correctly, and got some things upgraded, and that had an impact on what I did later, because I used some of the same company's technology to start doing my own shows, and this was like 2002.
So I suppose what we can blame you for the beginning of the religious influencer culture then. Right?
I don't know about that. But yeah, I mean, and so just a few years after that, after I got that degree, I was I just held some part-time jobs, and one of them was selling computers, because that was starting up, as I mentioned. And then, so I was finished with that program in 91. In 1997, I moved to Nashville to work for the United Methodist Publishing House. My parents, also lived there, so it wasn't an unfamiliar territory. I'd visited Nashville a lot, and then my two brothers lived in Nashville as well. So the whole family was there. And so it was an easy move for me, not so much for my wife, but she was excited about it too, and bought our first house. And so United Methodist Publishing House, 5.5 years, United Methodist Communications 5.5 years. There was like 6 months or about a year in between where I went from one to the other. And then, so after that, I was mainly a sort of a free agent in web development stuff, and did some work for the publishing house after. I mean, not the publishing house, but the communications program, because they always had web projects that they needed extra hands on, and I had worked on some of those and even built some of those. So they contracted with me, on several occasions in that. But during that time, the Occupy Wall Street movement started, and so me and my media and religious communications sort of started covering that, in my blogging, and my online, social media was just getting started then.
Yeah.
I think I started my doing that full force in like 2009. I had joined Facebook and Google and some of the other ones in 2007 when they began, but then in 2009, when I was sort of on my way out from the communications job, I started diving in headlong into social media. And so I was used to writing, and I've always been into writing. That church that I mentioned way back, in '76, I started a journal then. So I started, writing about what I was thinking about. Did that for like 7 years, and had like almost 3,000 pages of written journal pages that I have stashed away.
You have to publish that as a book one day, right?
Yeah, I could. And then, my writing kind of got funneled, the energy got funneled into the social media, and it was sort of a journalizing or a publicizing of my journals. So I became a little bit less introspective and more, kind of writing for an audience kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Explain things to people instead of to myself.
I've got to tell you, Dale, it's fascinating because you kind of like at the front, you had a front seat to the technology revolution while also having a front seat to the communication revolution, but from a religious perspective, which is possibly one of the most unique career trajectories I've actually come across. So I think, I don't think I've ever met anybody like you. So our theme today is ecotheology. So let's get stuck into it. So I suppose the best place to start is, what is it, and why is it so important?
Well, theology is, God talk, the two pieces of that word, theos and logos, and ecology, is ecosystem talk, and so ecotheology is talking about the ecosystem, from a perspective of of what God might think, or what the purpose of it is. I've come to a concept of God that is less of a anthropomorphization. I got that word out without much stumbling. But, thinking about God as as like some other form of human, when it's more complicated than that. And so the eco part of ecotheology causes you to talk about God differently, because you realize the intricate, the interrelationship of everything when you become an ecotheologian, and you're influenced by Genesis and the human condition, and what's it all about, and so I think in modern times, when we have more science to instruct us about how things came about, or how things might have come about, or what it looks like, to be the answer to the question of how things came about. You have the beginnings and the Big Bang, and and how things formed, and all the elements, and recently I've started reading this guy named Thomas Berry, who's sort of a eco-theological mentor for a lot of the people that I've, have sort of mentored me, and for the past 11 years, and as I've taken a dive, pretty much headlong into this. I mentioned 11 years because that was when I read. It's Naomi Klein book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate.
But she's not an eco-theologian. She's not in the.
She's not a
no.
theologian, but it really shaped, where my theology started heading. Since 2014. This was like September, October 2014. I bought it as a Kindle book. But then somewhere along the line, I had signed up on the Simon & Schuster site for a contest for a free copy. And so, sometime, like a month after I was into the book, reading it on a Kindle, this book shows up in my mailbox, a little letter from Simon & Schuster saying, "Congratulations on this."
Nice. So what was it? What was it about that book that sort of? I love a book that knocks your socks off. What was it about that one?
She tells a lot of stories, and she tells a lot of stories about what she calls blockadia, which is most of them involve indigenous communities protesting the incursion of extractive industries. Yeah. And so, she's in Canada, and so there was the tar sands in Alberta, and all the there was a big fire, I think, near Alberta, and just a lot of stories like that, not only in Canada but around the world, and her husband is a video producer, and so they did a video version of the book, and it mostly chronicled a lot of those blockadia stories. And she definitely described, along with that, the sense of urgency that we're now seeing because of what's happening scientifically, ecologically, with the earth. And so she started out talking about she just had her first child, and and she was reflecting on what all this means for what he's going to experience 20 years down the road. And that had an impact, and so the fact that she sort of pushed me through that door of waking up to the urgency of the climate crisis. I immediately went to some theological people that I had been reading that had mentioned it, but I didn't pay all that much attention to it. I just said, "Oh, that's an interesting angle." And I had always been a little bit interested in that, but nothing earth-shattering, no pun intended. And so Brian McLaren was one progressive theological person who had written things that I had been reading over the years for the past 20 years before that. And oddly enough, Naomi Klein's book was This Changes Everything. Brian McLaren had a book called Everything Must Change. And one of the chapters in it was the ecological situation. And so, he always did a good bibliography of sources, for what he had written about. And so I went and found a bunch of the books that he had in his bibliography. Also ran across Michael Dowd, who was doing a series of 100 interviews with people all across the spectrum that had to do with ecological philosophy and eco-theology and ecological economics and cosmological philosophy. And and Thomas Berry was somebody who was a mentor for Michael Dowd. Michael Dowd, also one of the people he interviewed was Drew Dellinger, who started following on, or immediately started following on social media, and he was also an Occupy Wall Street activist, which I'd gotten. I think I failed to mention that when I was talking about my
No, you
my,
mentioned
my
it briefly,
journey,
but not why. Yeah.
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 But prior to getting my present domain, which is ecoecclesia.org, I had a domain called occupytheology.org, and all my media and my writing was involved in ecological justice, economical justice issues. So, I'd already been interested in that, mainly because of Naomi Klein. She had written a book prior to this Changes Everything, called The Shock Doctrine, which was about how countries use crises to do radically oppressive economic things.
Yeah, it's
And
pretty apparent. Pretty apparent right now, right?
Yeah, and one of the stories that I think was one of the first ones in that book was Katrina, and what they did, or attempted to do, and in some ways succeeded in getting more entertainment built, and there were like tsunami struck areas in Asia that after the tsunami happened, all of a sudden all these beaches where fishing had been going on, and was the sustenance for a lot of people indigenous to the area. They were banned from the beachfront there, and what happened was that luxury hotels went up, so they took that catastrophe and out of the sense of public safety, kept people from the area, and for the purposes of developing it, for beachfront vacation stuff.
Yeah, well, they're worried about that in Hawaii after the fires, right?
Yeah.
LA, you look at who's buying the land and what they're planning to do with it. So
Yeah.
every time there's a disaster, right?
Yeah. So I've gotten into that, and there's scores of areas to to go out in all different directions with from ecotheology, because I kind of came in from economics, and then then I go back out to spirituality, because Thomas Berry and Leonardo Boff, who wrote a book called Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor, which I just finished before I started reading this Thomas Berry book, which is called The Dream of the Earth. Both of those guys, Boff and Berry, are are very scientific in their writing as well. Boff more so, and I was intrigued and fascinated with how they described it, and something I'll get into later when you talk about the the hope of ecotheology, but Boff talks about the energies of the cosmos, that part of that is all of the elements converging over millions and billions of years to get to the place where humans evolved, and humans are consist of the human body consists of all those elements, but it's not just the physical elements. There's this spiritual element, and both Boff and Berry talk about the evolution of the human mind, and not just the human mind, but the human mind is sort of the cosmos stuff.
Yeah.
And so to become to go back and recover a earth-centered consciousness or spirituality is sort of a natural thing. It's sort of a rediscovering of things that are have been submerged by Western civilization. and that's one of the books that I pulled out. Um, Matthew Fox, he was one of the, like a seed, what I call a seed planter in my ecological journey, because I have probably a dozen of his books and they were all from the 1990s, which was prior to this ecological emphasis that I have now. But
Right.
reading him made opened up that vista a little bit, so that I part of that energy I gained from that, and the realization that that there were earth energies and earth awareness that I kind of need to give more space to, to incorporate that into who I am. That kind of burst forth, after I, read the Naomi Klein book and started reading, related books. And a lot of those people were, people that were interviewed in that Michael Dowd series of 100 interviews, because, that's typical of the poly crisis, which is what a lot of people call the climate crisis. It's a poly crisis, because, it's economic, it's agricultural, it's spiritual, it's just
technological, it's societal, mental health, it's everything, right?
Yes.
So one of the things that I was looking at with ecotheology is that it's a lot of the theologists are really spending a lot of time looking at the words in the Bible, because how it's been interpreted in the past has, so a word like dominion is always sort of brought up, right? And the interpretation is that we have dominion, which means we're superior. And so a lot of the theologians are looking at the words, and they're looking at them with fresh eyes, with the eco lens over it. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because that sounds like it's a bit of an interesting sort of challenge that they're facing, trying to almost not reinterpret the Bible, but just look at it and maybe question whether or not they got that bit right. Which
well,
I know
dominion,
Christians don't like doing that.
The dominion word is a really good example, because like you said, the first off, or first glance, it's power over, and taking advantage of, and having one of those words that slips in my mind at the moment, where you use something because of what it can do for you, rather than its intrinsic value. And so technological society does that to the earth, and that's and a lot of people, eco philosophers blame, and this is partially true, they blame Christianity and its theology for that type of approach toward the earth. In fact, there was a guy, can't think of his first name right now, but his last name is White, and he wrote this article about the ecological roots, or the theological roots of the ecological crisis.
There's a really good white paper on it. I read it a little while ago. It's amazing.
Yeah.
But it's also goes back to colonial times.
Right.
And it's really an interesting point of view.
Yeah. And so the counter to that, for the dominion idea, is to look at the purpose, the positive purpose of having a dominion or a kingdom or whatever, is to take care of your subjects. Sort of like a good society, or a common good society, and the king looks after that. And after all, that was the original intent and purpose of Israel asking for a king, because they saw how other kingdoms or countries got organized and got wealthy because they had a king. And it turns out in a lot of those cases, the king went out and conquered other places, and to add to the those economies. Well, that's kind of what Western Christianity, did as well. They instead of mimicking the taking care of part, they mimicked the taking over part.
Mm-hmm.
And they went out and conquered and did that, not only to other countries but to ecological habitats.
Yeah.
Not having any forethought about any consequences of that, because one, they didn't have the science telling them that this is what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the reflection afterwards, and when consequences started happening because of that, to make the connection. Because after all, they're just building a kingdom, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly. But there's no excuse for that now, right? And yet it continues.
Right. No excuse. I often talk about I sort of date from 1988 and Hansen telling basically telling the world, because he got before Congress, because prior to that, scientists had been telling the U.S. government, and probably in other countries too, scientists have been telling the government, we better start thinking about this for the future, or even now, starting to do things now, and the governments weren't listening, and Hansen had had enough, and so he basically went on television, because C-SPAN and things like that were already in play, and so he knew that more people would see it, and more people did, and journalists started taking up the matter, and Bill McKibben's the first person I think of when I think of journalists taking up the topic and the issues and the cause, and pretty much from 1988 on, that's when Bill McKibben started writing all of this stuff.
And Margaret Thatcher, I mean, she was outspoken, so we did have leaders around the world, but it's and yet here we are using more fossil fuels than we ever had. People buy more clothes than they've ever bought that last less time than they ever have, and they throw them out, and then they end up in landfill somewhere on the other side of the world, and we just continue to consume. It's like it's this rabidness. It constantly amazes me. At some point we've got to look around and go, wait a minute, this isn't good for any of us. But I don't know. I've been waiting for that time for a long time, and I know you have too.
Yeah.
But I think religion's going to be a big part of the answer, and we can see what the Pope's doing. But so from your perspective, when it comes to the Christian community, especially in the US, what do you think of what are the obstacles that are holding it back? Is ecotheology becoming central to the doctrine, or is it still just a few people off in the corners of the church doing it? Because I know the Pope's putting it at the center of the Catholic Church and influencing other religious groups around the world. So what are you saying where you are?
Yeah. Well, I did my shelf picking thing, and I've got one that represents the Catholic Church, for our common home, and so this isn't Laudato Si itself, but it's process relational responses to Laudato Si, which this was a book written or collected together from people who were at this conference. That was one of the first major things that I did in terms of learning. This was, I don't know if you can see it, Seizing an Alternative Toward an Ecological Civilization. That was 2015. Reason I went there was, again, because Michael Dowd did those interviews, and like 3 or 4 people that he interviewed there were talking about this. Brian McLaren was, the theology person that I had been reading that I mentioned earlier. He was one of Michael Dowd's interviews. Philip Clayton, who's a professor of ecology and process theology at Claremont School of Theology, which is the United Methodist Seminary. And so this was at Pomona College, which is in Claremont, California. And it's the last time I've flown. I investigated driving so I wouldn't be flying, but then the amount of time it took and just working out the logistics of where to stay, it turned I checked about the sides of the flights, where to see that there was a lot of people on the flights, and so I felt better. That made me feel
Yeah, yeah.
better about the carbon footprint or any. So I went
Hey,
to that.
hey, you're thinking about it. Most people don't even think about it still. So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And and so most of everybody that I had been reading was there, and so
Oh,
I took
great.
video stuff with me. And let's see here, what did I do with it? Talking about the eco-theology stuff and faith, Earth Honoring Faith by Larry Rasmussen.
Yeah.
And I like quoted, you know, on my social media, and this was back in 2014 and 15, just for several days, probably several weeks, because I was reading and I'd stop and I'd say, oh, that's great. And I'd, post a
Mm.
quote from it. And I bought the hardback, book. And then so, well, I'll buy the Kindle too, because that'll make it easier to copy and paste. And when you copy from the Kindle, it automatically puts the reference there at the end for you. So
Right, right. Oh, there you go. There's a hot tip.
yeah, yeah. So and process theology, which is the subtitle of this book, For Our Common Home, process relational responses to Laudato Si. So Laudato Si had just come out the year before this conference in 2014. The conference was in 2015, and so they asked everybody that all the main presenters to write something about Laudato Si in there. And so this book came out shortly afterwards. Introduction by Bill McKibben. He was one of the keynote speakers at this conference, and Wes Jackson and Vandiva Shiva. And then author of this book, Earth Honoring Faith. And I often refer to that as like, it ought to be the textbook for a course in eco theology at seminaries, every one of them, but
Yeah.
you don't see it, and there's only like a handful of seminaries in the entire country that have eco theology programs at all, or even eco theology courses.
So, I mean, that's a bit of an irresponsibility, right, from a religious institution perspective, right? So, and then we know that in the US, there's the far right, the Christian nationalists. We've got Trump, climate con, all that sort of stuff. So, so is that the obstacle? There's this kind of loyalty within the faith towards denial because it links to, I don't know, some political belief. What is it? But I mean, you guys are seeing firsthand some of the impact. Right?
It's exactly that. I mean, it's subservience to the political ideology first, and that results in the denial. Because prior to the climate crisis, prior to 1990, you had like lots of Republicans that were very ecologically oriented, and those people just started getting primaried, basically. Bob Inglis is a South Carolina, I forget whether he's a rep or a senator, but he lost his seat because he had been talking about ecological issues. And then when the Republican Party started, going the opposite way, he lost his seat because that's not part of the dogma of the Republican Party anymore. And
so it's still, you're not seeing any shift at all, like as the extreme weather events get worse, and
nothing of the significance that it needs to be. I mean,
yeah, right.
It's just here and there, which is not going to cut it.
Yeah. Is it time for you to go back into the ministry and become an eco-theologian?
Well, I kind of think that's what I've been doing. Social media has afforded me the.
No, I mean, you're on stage with all those guys and girls that you admire. I think it's the time. Stop being the student and be at the front.
Yeah, I guess the church structure needs to change, to create a spot for that.
Yeah, right.
Because there's not any. I mean, for one thing, the churches have always been really bad at making theological and spiritual resources available. I mean, hardly any churches have anything like a library. I mean, and the ones that do, it's almost like a closet compared to the rest of the facility of the church. The library, it's over here. You go over there, and it's like it's like a little room that's, that barely a dozen people can fit into, and you've got like 5 bookshelves of things, and it's usually just books that the pastor's mentioned in his sermons.
Yeah.
That's why I have to go to the Vanderbilt Divinity School library to get anything of any depth in ecotheology or anything else in ecotheology.
Yeah. Oh, it looks like you've got your own personal library there. All right, so it's not really going anywhere, and it's probably going in the wrong direction, basically since the 80s, right? If that's what you were saying. So, but we can't give up, right? You and I are determined never to give up. We're fighting in our own way, with our own voices. Where do you get your hope from?
Well, part of that is, in some of the stirrings or the beginnings, like Laudato Si from the Catholic Church. There's eco-reformation, from the Protestant side, and this book was done by in 2017 by a bunch of Lutherans. In 2017 was the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation.
Yeah, right.
October, something. So they were writing with that in mind. And so, there's probably 95 theses, which is what Martin Luther nailed on the door of the Wittenberg Church to basically, kick off the Protestant Reformation. He wasn't thinking of a Protestant Reformation, but that's what it became. And it was, led by, his theological emphases. So what is it, I mean, he was, his 95 theses were basically talking about what he thought was missing from, the church that be, the Catholic powers that be. And so what would be the 95 ecotheology, theses that should be nailed up on,
right.
What church, what church would represent, the church in America? I don't know. But, there's probably several that could use, hey, these 95 things are important. Probably, narrow it down to 10, but all of those, just like there's a polycrisis, it just branches out naturally.
Well, maybe you could lead that initiative then. Get them. We need to do something, right? Because we've got COP30 going on this week. Americans not there. I think through religion and through the institutions of religion, we can make the most impact. You see with Pope Leo, there's 1.4 billion Catholics, and he's brought in, he's done, I don't know what he calls rituals with the Muslim community, Muslim leaders. I'm out in Asia where there's Hindu, there's Druze, there's Buddhism. I mean, there's so many different faiths in the world, right? And coming together, and I'll bring us up equally. Wait a minute, my mouse isn't working, so you don't feel like you're in the spotlight all the time. But I think 75% of the world's population follows a religion of some description. So if we could get the message through, I've spoken to some of the guys that we've met in Uganda who work in refugee camps, and one of the guys I spoke to, he basically across Uganda, through the churches, through the mosques, through the temples, they're getting the message out there. They're trying to turn the gardens and the land around the churches, temples, and mosques into food gardens. The churches, the faiths own an extraordinary amount of land, but if it's just pretty gardens, that's not really serving any purpose, right? But I do think, 75% of the world's population follows a religion of some description. That's the entry point. But it sounds like in America, it's just not there, So how do you deal with that?
Basically, trying to, to just, put forth an alternative, I guess, and say,
Yeah.
I'm always saying some form of, no, that's not it. No, I mean, since I was in seminary, and the guy that came in that took over the presidency of the seminary that I was at, he's somebody that makes me roll my eyes, constantly, and he was doing that from the get-go, and saying Southern Baptist or this and Southern, and no, that's not it.
Right.
And so it's just, so what's that been? That's 40, 45 years, 44 years, since I graduated from there. So I'm kind of used to the, rolling the eyes and being embarrassed by, and with, MAGA Christians, it's just, out the window.
Yeah, it's just the hypocrisy, right? The cruelty, as someone sitting outside of America looking at what's going on, it's, people who are fighting for to try and get rid of a woman's right to have an abortion, but then they don't take care of the children that are born. Just the way, if you're not white, basically, how you're being treated on the streets of your country at the moment. It's just, for a Christian nation, it's pretty damning for those of us outside watching it. I was reading one of the long reads about the Venezuelan guys that were put in the prison in which country was it again? Ecuador. That horrible prison.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just barbaric. Those people being killed on those boats off Venezuela. It's like, that's not Christianity. I walked away from the church, but I understood the concept of what it was supposed to mean. So it must be challenging to be part of an institution for so long that still has a lot of disappointment.
I think, the ecotheology track, I guess, for lack of a better term, it's helpful in that it enables people outside the faith to maybe see an avenue for becoming interested in some in some angle of faith, because there's that common ground of the ecological concern. I find that Climate Crisis Club, that's how I fit in there, is that, and that's why I got accepted there, is because I talked about, the climate crisis, and coming at it as a person of faith. And so, that in itself helps to dispel, the MAGA Christian right climate denying aspect of it, that it's not, entirely populated by, brain dead, brainwashed, ideologically centered, narcissistic people.
Yeah, unfortunately. So for the people who are in the Christian community in the United States, whether they're Baptist or Methodist or Lutheran or whatever else, because I know there's a lot more than that, what would you encourage them to do right now? The ones who know that there's a problem, and they want to see their churches sort of step into this moment and change directions from where they're currently going. What's your message to them?
I guess it would, I mean, at its most basic, just start talking about it, first.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what people expect of you. Is to make you aware. It used to be the church's job to inform people. Before there was mass media, that was the media. The priest, was the conveyor of information about the world.
Yeah.
If we were still in that situation, we'd be in, probably dire trouble, because if priests still and preachers and priests still took the track of what so much of Christianity has taken, which is to appropriate culture and to make people feel good about living in it, rather than be prophetic, which should be a key part of it, the prophetic aspect, prophetic imagination. I failed to mention that during this whole thing, that prophetic imagination is what we need to see through what's referred to in the Matrix as the thing that's been pulled over your eyes to blind you to the truth. That's what the Matrix is. And the church isn't being prophetic in that way. It's not enabling people to see through that, or even to realize that there is something blinding them to the truth. They're just soaking it in.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Oh, I can't believe how quickly this time has gone. It's been really lovely to talk to you, but I figure we'll let everyone go. But thanks for spending the time with me. Every time you speak, I'm always listening in, and I believe that religion is a central pillar in the fight. And one of the problems we've got, of course, is there's an extreme element. But I think if we can bring the rest of the world together through religion, but I do fear the extremists, not just in the US. There's extremism happening around the world. But just really appreciate your insights, and thanks for joining me.
Yeah, well, thanks for asking me.
And you're going to go and spend time with your grandkids now, right?
Oh yeah, always.
All right. Thanks. I'll see you soon.
All right. Bye.
Uncommon courage.